My house was just the same as any other in the locality with a modest front lawn and a garden that even boasted a little statue attached to a fountain. After my graduation, I secured a job, and one of the first things I used the first year's salary for was to rejuvenate my house, making it look bigger. Over the years, I even managed to expand it, adding a floor, and I leased both floors out to Jim, a guy in his mid-50s. Well, Jim wanted to use the building not only as his home, but also as his office. I was fine with this, providing that only the first floor be used for office purposes while the ground floor and everything else would remain the same. He was fine with that, and after some more discussions, I decided to lease it out to him. I was not there with him in person when the keys had to be handed over, and I hired someone to handle the last stages of the deal. And this was because I had been transferred to another city for my job, and I could only visit the place about once a year. I didn't actually mind this though because my dad had been in a coma for a few years, and my mom had passed earlier. Being a single guy who still hadn't gotten over the loss, I didn't like to stay in the house of mine alone. Not only was it stressful to live alone, but I kept remembering my childhood days, and for some reason, it made me sad. Now, it's important to note that the building was in my dad's name, but he had already given me the rights to the property. His name was still on all the documents that are pertained to the building. It was a messy situation, and I'm still not sure if I understood how everything worked, but my lawyer assured me that this was normal and that he was working on getting it transferred fully in my name since we had written proof about my dad's intention. But yes, coming back to the story. I was glad that I didn't have to visit the place often. Jim, for his part, must have also been happy that I didn't bother him too much. During the initial few conversations over the phone, I could tell that he was a busy person. Over the year, I heard from neighbors that he had set up his office and engaged staff who worked there during the day. I heard that he had even hired a professional gardener who was in charge of the beautiful garden and garden fittings that my parents had so fondly built. I, as the owner, was happy to know that the place was being cared for, since I've heard horror stories from my friends of nightmare tenants. It was about October when I got a call from my lawyer informing me that the corrections regarding the property owners' names had been corrected and that I should set up a meeting with the tenant sometime soon to get our papers in order. The lease he had signed was for 1 year, and since it would be needing renewing in December, I figured I would visit the home to not just ensure the maintenance aspect, but also to talk to my tenant regarding said renewal of the lease. I called up Jim to inform him that I would be dropping by, but multiple attempts at reaching him only found me talking to his secretary. I finally just told her to pass on a message that the owner would be dropping by a week before Christmas. I never got a call back from Jim, which sort of annoyed me. The least you can do is acknowledge a message. How difficult is that? Anyway, it was getting close to Christmas, and I had a bunch of decorations that we always put up outside the house, which I decided to take with me and hand over to Jim to keep up the old tradition. I once tried to reach him to inform him about my visit. He didn't pick up the call. Well, once I started my journey, I tried him again, but once more, no luck. Even his secretary seemed to be ghosting me. What was going on? When I reached the place, I was surprised to see at the front gate a huge sign with the name of the office Jim had set up. I had never mentioned that he could do that. The only part that was to be commercial space was the first floor. It looked like he had converted the entire building to an office space. I was furious. The beautiful plants my parents had planted that I thought he was taking care of had been chopped down. The entire vibe of the place had changed, and he never once thought that maybe, just maybe, it would be a good idea to check with the owner before making changes that were not agreed upon. I wondered why my neighbors hadn't informed me about what had happened. I walked around to the home of the family that had updated me previously and noticed that they seemed to have moved out. A for sale sign was on their front yard. Damn. If I had known what was happening, I would have taken time off and stopped this. I was also thinking about my dad. The doctors did mention that there was a chance that he might wake up, and I couldn't stand to imagine how he would feel to come back to his home and find it like this. I collected my thoughts, and I tried to let myself in, but realized the front gate was locked. I proceeded to knock, rather loudly, and saw some movement on the first floor. A young woman poked her head out the window. I assumed that this might be the secretary who never bothered to pass on my messages. "What do you want?" she asked. "Is Jim around? I need to see him." She blinks for a moment. "Please leave it by the gate, thank you." With that, she goes back in and shuts the window. I knock once more and keep knocking until I hear someone come down the stairs and then the gate finally opens. I'm about to speak when he asks quite rudely, "What do you want?" "You're Jim, aren't you? I'm the owner of the building." I expect him to flush with embarrassment and apologize, but instead he gives me a sarcastic laugh. "Is that right?" "Yes, that's right. Can you answer my question? Are you Jim?" "You dare to ask me my name? You're a delivery boy, and your duty is to hand over whatever parcel you've brought without asking questions you have no right to be asking." I lose my patience and I begin to snap back. I am the son of the owner of this building. It was me who leased the first floor to the owner of this office here, and I would like to meet the owner, Jim. "Do you want to get fired from your little delivery job? Is that it?" "Believe me, I can make your life hell. Stop trying to play your silly pranks on me and leave before I call the cops." I begin to mention my father's name in hopes that he will realize his mistake and even pull out a copy of the lease on my phone as proof to show him, but I can see that there isn't a point. This was one of those times that you intuitively know that there is no use in arguing. I tell him that he's going to regret what he has done with the building. There was a good bit more useless back and forth that happened after this, but it made no difference, and I told him that I would be filing a lawsuit. Now, it's important to remember that the state we were in was a one-party consent state. Well, it means that audio and video and other forms of recordings can be accepted in court as evidence, even if taken without the knowledge of the other party. The second the secretary had dismissed me from the window, I felt something was up and had secretly begun recording the entire conversation on my phone. The fact that I had screenshots of our initial correspondence and bank statements of the lease amount coming right to my account made the case ridiculously easy. I had even sent Jim an email about the lease date changes when I had been trying to reach him, so there was little that he could do to deny it. The day that the legal notice reached him, I get a call from an unknown number, and it was Jim. He proceeds to tell me that I was making a big mistake with the case and that if I knew better, I would drop the charges. I sort of laughed and just hung up. Long story short, I won the legal case and was able to get a decent amount of damages that would help as compensation for the changes to the garden that he made. My career had another change, and I also ended up getting transferred back a few months sometime later. I decided to move back in and take care of the place myself, even if it meant dealing with sad memories. It was not worth having my childhood home ruined by people who had no respect. By this time, Jim was forced to move out, but there was some furniture that he left behind, which I guess he would come back for later. Anyway, I repainted my house, fixed up the garden, and engaged people to maintain it. I also made sure that I hired a security guard for the front gate, since I was a bit unsure about what this guy had in mind when he said that I would regret filing the case. A few months later, I had settled back in. My security told me that someone was at the gate with a truck to pick up the furniture. It was at this moment that I decided to have some payback. I replied, "Ask him whether he's got proof to show that these are indeed his belongings." Gotcha. Jim realized what was happening and left, slamming the truck door hard. I tell ya, there's nothing sweeter than justified revenge. Anyway, I just wanted to rub it in, and I had no intention of stealing his gaudy furniture. I saw to it that every bit of furniture was returned to him later on. I knew that I could keep the furniture for myself and taunt him more, but letting it go was another victory for my morality. I still find it odd when I think back on this whole incident, though. What were Jim's real intentions? Did he expect to just take over the entire place? Just like that? Perhaps he had come to know that the changes needed in the lease and thought he could try his luck trying to take over the home. It didn't make any sense, but I guess some people are just crazy like that. My dad eventually got better and now lives with me. God knows where Jim is these days, but I hope he learned his lesson and doesn't try scamming other people out of their property again. I had finally gone fully in sea with my parents. I love them, but I don't think we've ever really liked each other. They were controlling and judgmental and, honestly, just a lot to deal with. Their love was conditional, and if you weren't doing things or living the way they wanted, they'd cut you out of the family's life until you got back on track. Well, they already had little access to my life, but one thing I did allow them access to was my streaming services. I have basically all of them and gave my parents the usernames and passwords. My parents did end up making a lot of their own accounts because somehow my accounts would just end up being used by people I never gave access to. So I changed my passwords every so often to kick the outliers off, and they got tired of having to ask me. The only account they still used was their favorite, Apple TV. I had personally logged into it on only one TV in their house because I didn't trust them with the password to my entire Apple account. I honestly rarely used Apple TV. If it wasn't Ted Lasso or a movie I bought or rented, I don't really care. But my parents were constantly on it. Once they even called me upset because I started watching one of the movies that they had been watching at the same time, and I guess it messed up and started over. A month on, NC goes by, and I decide that I want to watch one of my purchase movies. And what do I see? My parents, who apparently want nothing to do with me, are still enjoying their favorite shows on my account, not giving a damn. Blackbird, Loot, For All Mankind, Players, The Bankers, my whole Up Next feed was filled up with their shows. I was pissed. The audacity of verbally abusing me to the point where I went NC but still using my crap, it's astounding, honestly. So, right there and then, I logged into my Apple account, changed the password twice, and logged out of all devices. The small chaos that ensued gives me giggles to this day. Apparently, my mother was in the middle of the finale of Loot when I logged her out, and season 3 of C was 2 days from being released. My dad's a huge fan. According to my inside source, they ranted for days about how petty of a B word I am and how low I had to stoop to kick them off when they weren't doing anything wrong. How dare I do this to them, unprovoked and out of the blue? What a horrible daughter I was to snatch away something so meaningless, something that I didn't even use anyway. I don't know if they ended up making an account of their own or gave up. All I know is it makes me giggle every time I see a commercial for an Apple TV show, knowing I got the smallest of petty revenges. This is my father's story. Told with his permission, I wanted to brag about my dad's decision to stick it to a jerk. My grandparents built, then lived in, the same house since the early 70s. It has 5 acres and was a small scale farm for their family growing up. They both passed away within a month of each other several months ago. Their kids, my parents, aunts, and uncles, didn't need the home, and none of their kids, my siblings, cousins, nor I, could afford it. It was in a trust, so all siblings needed to agree to make the price, etc., while most just wanted it to be sold quickly so that they could move on with their lives. They spent a couple of months cleaning the property and house up, repairing anything minor, and then putting it on the market. Comparables estimate the property over $850,000. But it did need more work. The roof replaced, some cosmetic work on the foundation, wiring was updated back in the early 2000s. There were a couple of people showing interest, but no serious offers for a couple of months. So we dropped the price down to around $830,000. Well, since there was a little more work to be done. Enter the most scuzzy realtor slash buyer. He wanted it, but his wife really wanted it. They had put their house, in a more urban setting with a small fraction of an acre, on the market, and were under contract and basically guaranteed the same of their house for an obscene amount of money. According to my father, I forgot to ask how much their realtor found out it sold for. They negotiated down to $740,000, and all of the siblings, since the property was in a trust account, accepted. Sad to see it go to someone outside the family, but what do you do? Nobody could afford it or needed that much property. He represented himself as a realtor, which would mean he gets a percentage of the final price back at the end of it all. I understand it's not technically illegal in our state, but it's kind of BS in my opinion. Then he started asking for a reduced price for many things like the cost of taking the outbuildings down, a horse corral, horse track shed, greenhouse, and disconnected garage that was set up as a workshop. He said that they were all a hazard and that he shouldn't have to pay for them coming down. They passed building codes, it just didn't look perfect cosmetic on the outside. Just one example of many. We just wanted to move on with our lives. But after we would accept an offer, he would then ask for more, drive the cost lower, eventually got it down nearly below $600,000. He had about $3,000 tied up in escrow to purchase it, and his deadline for closing on the house or losing that money was approaching. But he kept asking for more. Because he kept negotiating, he passed his deadline to get his money back, and then he asked for $580,000. Well, then my father snapped, and I've never seen him snap. I've never seen him get petty, but I'm glad he did. He called a nephew who had horses but wanted more property for adequate training and riding space. Couldn't afford what it was actually with, so he had passed on it before. My father asked if they would qualify for the last accepted price, just over $600,000, and they did. All the Sublime agreed, and so they declined the realtor dude's offer and said, "Never mind, we won't sell to you," through their realtor, of course. So the jerk loses his $3,000, doesn't get the house, and doesn't have a home at all. He apparently really thought that he would get my grandpa's house, so his house was closed on and he would have to move out very soon. To say he was pissed is an understatement. Our poor realtor had to be the gatekeeper, but she at least took satisfaction in pointing out to him that it was only his fault that he didn't get the house. We have to wait until the realtor guy signs the termination paperwork, which he's delaying since that was all that he had left to try to stick it to our family. But Grandpa's house is staying in the family once that final date passes, less than a week left. My parents may not have sold the house for what it's worth, but it was worth sticking it to that guy. Screw him. Update. The jerk gave up and signed the paperwork yesterday, so my cousin will begin the buying process Monday.